Princess Valera thought she knew what strength looked like, until the day she ordered the human commander to remove his armor in the middle of her war room. What crawled out of that charcoal-grey coffin wasn't a man. It was the brutal, broken truth of what humanity does to itself just to keep her empire alive. And by the time the swarm's harvester darkened her sky, she would learn that the most terrifying weapon in the galaxy was a human who finally had something worth fighting for. The atmosphere in the high command of the Valerius Empire was thick with the scent of synthetic lilies and the sterile metallic tang of ionized shields. Princess Valera stood at the center of the crystalline dais, her lavender skin shimmering under the ambient bioluminescence of the war room. For 3 cycles, she had watched the human liaison, Commander Elias Thorne, coordinate the defense of her outer colonies against the swarm, a mindless biological tide that consumed worlds. Elias was a strange creature, even by the standards of the diverse Galactic Concord. He was always encased in his massive charcoal-grey tactical plating, a suit of powered armor that made him look more like a primitive golem than a representative of a spacefaring species. While the Valerius generals wore flowing robes embedded with microscopic pulse emitters, Elias was a silhouette of jagged edges and heavy hydraulics. He had been on her planet for 6 months, and in all that time, Valera had never seen his face, nor had anyone heard him complain about the crushing gravity of her homeworld. Today, however, the professional facade was fraying. The swarm had breached the nebula gates, and the casualty reports were coming in not as data points, but as screams over the comms. Elias stood over the holographic star chart, his armored fingers moving with a precision that contradicted the bulk of his gauntlets. He was rerouting human strikeback squads to the civilian sectors, ignoring the strategic importance of the lithium mines. Valera watched the way his armor hummed, a deep rhythmic vibration that felt less like technology and more like a trapped beast trying to breathe. It was a distributed power system that the Valerius engineers found archaic, yet it never flickered, even when the palace's own grid groaned under the pressure of the invasion. She noticed that the commander's movements were slower today, his posture slightly stooped as if the very air had turned to lead. "Commander Thorne," Valera began, her voice carrying the melodic yet firm tone of a ruler who had been trained since birth to command respect from a dozen different subspecies. "Your infrastructure report on the trenchline defenses was insightful, if a bit grim. You speak of sacrifice zones and kinetic attrition, as if they are basic arithmetic." She walked toward him, the floor humming faintly beneath her feet, a sensation she had grown to accept alongside the strange floral ozone of her palace. Elias didn't turn immediately. He finished marking a high-explosive perimeter on the map before his helmet tilted toward her. The visor was a polarized slab of reinforced glass, reflecting her own royal visage back at her. To her, he looked like a statue of war, cold and unyielding, a stark contrast to the vivid, expressive faces of her own people, whose long ears and color-shifting skin telegraphed every emotion. "Princess," his voice came through the external speakers, distorted by a slight metallic rasp. "War isn't poetry, it's plumbing. You have a leak, you plug it with whatever is heavy enough to stop the flow. Right now, the swarm is the water, and my boys are the lead pipes." He adjusted his stance, and Valera heard the whine of overworked servos in his knee joints. It was a sound of mechanical protest that made her wince. Her own generals looked on with barely concealed disdain. To them, the humans were brutish and inelegant, a species that relied on panicking productively rather than the refined, long-term strategic projections of the Valerius mind. They saw the human armor as a sign of weakness, a crutch for a fragile, soft-skinned race that couldn't survive a skirmish without hiding inside a metal shell. Valera felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the cultural incompetence the humans often joked about, or perhaps it was a genuine concern for the man who had stayed awake for 72 hours straight defending her borders. "You are exhausted, Elias," she said, dropping the formal commander for a brief, dangerous second. "The vibrations of your suit are becoming erratic. My stewards tell me you haven't left that shell in weeks. You are in the heart of the Valerius Palace, the most secure location in the quadrant. There is no swarm here. There are no kinetic projectiles." She stepped onto the raised presentation platform where he stood, bringing her within 2 feet of the metal giant. "As your host and your princess, I order you, take off your armor. Let us provide you with the comforts of our healing chambers. Let us see the ally who has bled for us." The silence that followed was profound. The various advisors and officials in the room froze, their ears angling forward in a collective expression of shock. To ask a soldier to disrobe in the middle of a high command session was a breach of a dozen protocols, yet Valera felt the necessity of it. She wanted to bridge the distance between their species, to move past the professional distance and see the reality of the human factor. Elias's helmet tilted down, staring at the floor that gleamed like obsidian. For a moment she thought he would refuse, that he would cite standard operating procedure or some other human military dogma. The air felt charged, the floral scent of the room suddenly overwhelmed by the smell of hot oil and scorched ceramic coming from the man in front of her. "Princess," Elias said softly, the speakers clicking as he lowered the volume so only she could hear. "You don't want to see what's under the hood. Humans, we don't build things to be pretty. We build them to degrade gracefully. And I've been degrading for a long time." Valera didn't flinch. She reached out, her lavender fingers hovering just inches from his chest plate. She could feel the heat radiating off it, a feverish, artificial warmth. "I have seen the magnificent architecture of your ships and the poetic logic of your weapons, Elias. I am not afraid of the reality of your warfare. I am tired of talking to a ghost in a machine." She looked directly into the polarized visor, hoping he could see the sincerity in her dark eyes. "Please, show us the man who saved the nebula gates." Elias stayed still for a heartbeat longer. Then a series of sharp, pressurized hisses erupted from his neck seals. The sound was like gravel in a disposal unit, harsh and startling. The advisors gasped, some stepping back as if they expected the suit to explode. But it was just the seals breaking. Slowly, with a groan of metal on metal, the locking pins began to retract. Elias reached up, his massive gauntlets moving to the manual release toggles at his throat. The membrane of his professional facade was finally rippling, preparing to reveal what lay beneath the charcoal grey exterior. Valera held her breath, her heart performing an impressive gymnastics routine in her chest. She expected to see a tired man, perhaps scarred, perhaps pale from the lack of sun. She was prepared for a human. She was not prepared for the reality of what it took for a human to stand equal to the monsters of the void. The helmet didn't just come off, it hissed as the internal atmosphere equalized with the floral-scented air of the palace. When Elias lifted the heavy slab of composite plating away, the first thing Valera noticed wasn't his face, but the steam. A thin, wispy vapor rose from his shoulders, the heat of a body that had been cooking inside a mechanical furnace for weeks. As the mist cleared, the princess took an involuntary step back. Elias's skin wasn't the healthy, vibrant tan she had seen in the recruitment broadcasts from Earth. It was the color of old parchment, translucent and mapped with a web of angry purple veins that throbbed in time with the palace's energy grid. His hair, what was left of it, was plastered to a scalp that looked bruised. But it was the tech, the invasive, brutal tech that silenced the room. Thick, carbon fiber data ports were bolted directly into his jawline and temples. Where a Valerius might wear a delicate thinking circlet, Elias had heavy-duty shunts drilled into his bone to allow his brain to talk to the suit's targeting computer at the speed of thought. He blinked, his eyes bloodshot and darting around as if trying to calibrate to the natural light. When his gaze finally settled on Valera, she saw a flicker of that distinguished but exhausted diplomat he pretended to be, but it was buried under layers of trauma. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a victim of a high-speed industrial accident that had been frozen in time by the armor. The various advisors whispered in horror, their ears flattening in a collective gesture of revulsion. They saw the brutish nature of human warfare not in the explosions, but in the physical cost of the man standing before them. "The armor isn't a shell, Princess," Elias said, his voice now natural, stripped of the metallic rasp of the speakers. It was a raw, tired sound that made his earlier jokes about panicking productively feel like a shield of its own. "It's a life support system. Our biology wasn't built for the G-forces of the strike-back maneuvers or the radiation of the nebula gates. Evolution gave us soft skin and fragile bones. We had to fix the inelegant design ourselves." He began to unlatch the chest piece, a massive section of plating that required him to trigger a series of emergency overrides. As the front of the suit swung open like a heavy vault door, Valera realized that the armor didn't just sit on him, it was integrated. Underneath the charcoal plating, Elias wore a liquid-cooled compression suit, but it was torn and fused to his skin in several places. Across his chest, a long, jagged scar, the mark of a swarm-piercer limb, was held together by crude, mechanical staples that hummed with a faint blue light. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a component. This was the distributed energy system he had mentioned. The suit took the heat from his own body and recycled it into power for the shields. It was a symbiotic relationship born of desperation. The Valerius General Vax stepped forward, his expression one of barely concealed disdain, turning into a cold, clinical fascination. He reached out toward the data ports on Elias's arm, but the commander flinched, a sudden violent movement that made the servos in his legs scream in protest. "Don't," Elias warned, and for the first time, the princess saw the aggressive bouncer he had once joked about. The exhaustion was there, but so was a predatory alertness that made the air in the room feel thin. This tech is living in a way your organic ships aren't. It's hooked into my nervous system. If you touch the wrong lead, my heart might decide to stop, or yours might. He took a shaky breath, his chest rattling with a sound that suggested his lungs were partially filled with fluid, a common side effect of high-gravity combat that no Valerius physician would ever have to treat. Valera felt a wave of citrus and regret wash over her. Regret for asking him to show her this, and a sour citrus-like sharp realization of what her safety actually cost. She looked at her advisors, the stern faces and formal robes that shimmered like oil on water. They looked pristine, untouched by the reality of the conflict they directed from their obsidian floors. Elias, in his half-open suit, looked like a coral reef of scar tissue and hardware. He was the water purification system of the war, filtering out the filth of the swarm so that the rest of the galaxy could remain clean and poetic. The princess moved closer again, ignoring the insistent pulses of the palace security drones that were now hovering nearby, confused by the sudden change in Elias's biometric signature. She reached out, not to touch the tech, but to gently touch the one patch of unscarred skin on his forearm. It was burning hot. "You have a fever, Elias," she whispered. The commander gave a weak, lopsided smile, the kind of rare smile she had come to value, though now it felt heavy with the weight of 30 pounds of unspoken pain. "In my world, we call that Tuesday, princess. The suit keeps the infection at bay by cauterizing the wounds from the inside. It's efficient. Not pretty, but efficient." He looked at the holographic map, where the blue lines of the civilian sectors were still pulsing. "I need to get back in. The swarm doesn't care if I'm distinguished or exhausted. They just care if I'm standing in their way." Valera looked at the massive charcoal grey helmet resting on the dais. It looked like a tomb. She realized then that the professional facade she had admired for 6 months was a cage. Every time he had addressed her as "my queen," with that safely formal tone, he was doing so while his own body was being systematically dismantled by the machinery required to keep her throne secure. The humming floors and the solidified light of her palace felt like a mockery in the face of his brutish reality. She looked at Minister Cora, who was openly grinning no longer. The older woman looked as if she were about to weep. The reality of human warfare wasn't about the ships or the lasers. It was about the terrifying, stubborn endurance of a species that refused to die, even when their own biology told them it was time. "You said humans think in short timescales," Valera said, her voice trembling slightly as she recalled his words from the infrastructure presentation. "But you spend your entire lives in these moments, don't you? You compress an entire eternity of suffering into a single hour of service." Elias shrugged, a clunky mechanical movement. "We're excellent at brute force solutions, remember? And right now, the most brute force thing I can do is stay awake for another 6 hours." He reached for his helmet, his long fingers trembling as they brushed the reinforced glass. Valera stepped in front of him, blocking his reach. "No, not yet. If your technology is rejecting your body, then we will use ours to bridge the gap. Our water purification colonies are living organisms, Elias. They heal, they adapt. If we can integrate human mechanical regulators with Valerius membranes, then we can integrate your fragile frame with our healing arts." She turned to the room, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling with a new, fierce authority. "General Vax, Minister Cora, prepare the royal immersion tanks. We are not just defending a sector today. We are saving the man who carries the weight of our world on his back." The royal immersion tanks were not the sterile stainless steel medical bays Elias had expected. Instead, they were deep, glowing pools of bioluminescent fluid carved directly into the obsidian foundations of the palace. The room smelled of that heavy floral ozone, but here it was concentrated, thick enough to taste on the back of the tongue. Princess Valera watched as her medical acolytes, beings with multiple, slender limbs and skin that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic green light, approached the human. They moved with a practiced ease, their long ears angled forward in a sign of intense focus. Elias sat on the edge of the dais, his legs still encased in the lower half of his armor. The jagged edges of the metal looked like a scar on the perfection of the room. He looked small without the chest plate, a pale, shivering creature of soft skin and fragile bones, surrounded by the magnificent architecture of a Tier 4 civilization. "This fluid," Elias rasped, his eyes tracking the ripples in the pool. "It's alive, isn't it?" Valera nodded, stepping closer so the cool and tingly light of the chamber washed over both of them. "It is a symbiotic colony of microorganisms, Elias. They don't just heal surface wounds, they read your DNA and collaborate with your biology to repair cellular damage. It is the same principle as the water purification system you proposed for our lower districts. We don't use brute force to fix a body. We invite the body to thrive. She saw him hesitate, his hand hovering over one of the carbon fiber data ports in his neck. My tech won't like it. The suit's OS is aggressive. It's designed to reject foreign materials to prevent biowarfare. We've accounted for rejection issues, Valera countered, echoing his own professional tone from their earlier briefings. Our acolytes have modified the fluid's protein markers to be recognized as neutral by your sensors. Think of it as a universal translator but for your immune system. Elias gave a tired, lopsided smile that didn't reach his bloodshot eyes. You've been paying attention to my reports, he sighed, a sound that rattled deep in his chest. With a grunt of pain, he triggered the final release on his leg greaves. The heavy metal plates fell away, hitting the floor with a dull thud that echoed into infinity against the vaulted ceiling. Free of the armor, he looked even more terrible. His legs were atrophied, covered in the same purple web of veins and pressure sores from the suit's internal kinetic regulators. As the acolytes helped him into the pool, the fluid didn't just wet his skin, it seemed to reach out, rippling like a membrane to meet him. Elias gasped, his body stiffening as the bioluminescent organisms began their work. It feels like needles, he choked out, his fingers clenching the obsidian edge of the tank. Millions of tiny, cold needles. Valera knelt beside him, ignoring the way the fluid stained the hem of her formal robes. That is the handshake at the cellular level. They are mapping your nervous system, Elias. They are finding the points where the steel meets the flesh. She watched as the angry purple inflammation around his data ports began to fade, replaced by a soft emerald glow. It was poetic in a way that made her heart ache. The most advanced healing, technology in the quadrant working to mend a man who had been degrading gracefully for the sake of people who barely understood his sacrifice. The stern faces of the council members were visible through the transparent doors of the chamber. They were watching, their ears angled in a mix of skepticism and awe. Ambassador Thex looked personally offended by the sight of the human in the sacred tanks, while General Vax was perpetually calculating, likely wondering how this new integration would affect the defense grid of the Empire. But Valera didn't care about the politics or the trade agreements. She was focused on the way Elias's breathing was finally slowing down. The rattle in his lungs was disappearing, replaced by a deep, steady rhythm. For the first time in 6 months, the humming floors beneath him weren't a source of stress, but a cradle. "Why are you doing this, Valera?" Elias whispered, his eyes closed as the fluid rose to his chin. "I'm just a temporarily assigned asset. There are 7,000 regulations against this kind of personal intervention." The princess reached out, her hand hovering just above the surface of the water, mirroring the way he had once studied a holographic display. "Because you were right, Elias. Diplomacy and trade are supposed to serve the people, not the other way around. And you are the person I choose to serve today." She felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing, a connection that bypassed the cultural taboos of her station. "You told me humans are excellent at panicking productively. Well, I am panicking, but I am choosing to be productive by ensuring you don't collapse from exhaustion in my palace." The green light in the tank flared, the bioluminescence intensifying as the organisms reached the deep-seated trauma in his bone marrow. Elias let out a long, shaky breath, and the tension that had defined his silhouette for months finally dissolved. He looked refreshing, stripped of the performance of the commander. "I've spent 8 years," he murmured, his voice drifting as the fluid's sedative properties took hold. "Being the bouncer at the door of the galaxy, I forgot what it felt like to just be the guest." Valera watched him drift into the first real sleep he'd had in cycles. She knew that when he woke, the scandal would be waiting. The council would have detailed implementation schedules for their judgment, and the political firestorm she had ignited would be raging. But as she watched the emerald light knit his broken skin back together, she realized that impossible is just another word for difficult. And looking at the man in the tank, she knew that this difficult thing was the only thing worth doing. The distance between two people wasn't light years. It was the courage to take off the armor and show the vulnerable truth underneath. She stayed there, a princess of the Valerius guarding the sleep of a human soldier, while the city below glowed with a pristine and stable light, completely unaware that their queen had finally decided to make a decision based purely on what she actually wanted. Elias woke not to the sound of klaxons, but to a silence so profound it felt heavy. For a moment his mind panicked, reaching for the familiar HUD heads-up display of his armor, expecting the scrolling green data of oxygen levels and shield integrity. Instead, he saw the soft vaulted ceiling of the Royal Infirmary, a space carved from translucent marble that seemed to breathe with a pale violet light. He tried to sit up, expecting the usual grinding protest of his joints and the sharp stab of his data ports fighting his nervous system. Instead, his body felt light, almost buoyant. The rattle in his chest was gone. He looked down at his arms. The angry purple web of veins had receded, replaced by smooth, healthy skin that felt strangely alien to him. The internal sensors say you are at 98% cellular optimization, a voice said from the shadows. Princess Valera stepped into the light, her formal robes replaced by a simpler, charcoal-colored wrap that mirrored the color of his discarded armor. She looked tired, her vivid, expressive face marked by dark circles under her eyes. My acolytes wanted to keep you under for another 12 hours, but your aggressive OS started sending distress signals to the palace network. It seems your suit misses you as much as you miss it. Elias swung his legs over the side of the bed. For the first time in years, he felt the floor, not through the haptic sensors of a boot, but through the nerve endings in his feet. The humming floors of the Valerius palace felt like a gentle pulse, a heartbeat he had been deaf to. It's not affection, Princess. It's a watchdog. If the suit doesn't detect my biometric signature for too long, it assumes I've been captured and initiates a scorch protocol to wipe the hard drives. He looked at the corner of the room where his armor stood on a reinforced rack. It looked different now, less like a suit of power and more like a hollowed-out carcass. You speak of it as a tool, Valera said, walking toward the armor. She reached out, her fingers tracing a deep gouge in the shoulder plating where a swarm blade had nearly taken his arm. But I saw the logs while you were in the tank. The suit doesn't just protect you. It monitors your memories, your stress levels, your human impulses. It's a cage built of kinetic attrition. How do you live like this? How does your species endure a life where even your clothes are designed to degrade gracefully alongside your sanity? Elias stood up, testing his balance. He felt refreshing, but there was a hollowness in his gut. Without the armor, he felt exposed, like a soft-shelled crab between molts. We don't have the poetic longevity of your people, Valera. We're short-term thinkers because we have to be. We get 80, maybe 90 years if we're lucky. If we spend those years waiting for the perfect moment or the elegant solution, the swarm would have eaten Earth before we even invented the wheel. We use brute force because time is the one resource we can't manufacture. He walked toward the armor, his long fingers brushing the cold ceramic. You see a cage. I see a bridge. This metal allowed a kid from a dirt farm in Ohio to stand in a palace made of light and talk to a princess. It allowed me to carry the weight of 1 billion lives on my shoulders without snapping in half. He turned to her, his bloodshot eyes now clear and piercing. The reality of human warfare isn't that we like the armor, it's that we're willing to become the ghost in the machine so that people like you don't have to know what the swarm tastes like. Valera looked at him, and for a second, the professional distance between them completely vanished. She saw the vulnerable truth he had tried to hide, that he wasn't a warrior by nature, but by necessity. He was a plumber fixing a leaking universe with his own blood. The council is meeting in an hour, she said softly, her voice echoing off the solidified light of the walls. General Vax is calling for your immediate re-encasement. He argues that a human without armor is a diplomatic liability, a reminder of our own fragility. They want the ghost back in the machine, Elias. They find the man too unsettling. Elias chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. I'll bet they do. Nothing ruins a magnificent victory feast like seeing the guy who actually did the bleeding. He grabbed his compression undersuit from the rack. But Vax is right about one thing. The swarm just broke through the secondary line at the Orestes belt. I saw the ping on my internal shunt before I woke up. I don't have the luxury of being a guest anymore. Valera stepped closer, her hand resting on the charcoal-grey chest plate. What if there was a third way? What if we didn't just re-encase you? My engineers have been studying your archaic hydraulics. They say your suit is fighting your body because it's trying to do everything alone. But our technology is collaborative. If we bonded Valerius neural mesh to your armor's frame, the suit wouldn't have to cauterize you to keep you moving. It would heal you while you fought. Elias paused, a boot halfway on. Surprised. That's impossible. Princess. Your tech is organic. Mine is cold steel. They'd reject each other in seconds. Impossible is just another word for difficult. Valera quoted back at him, a rare smile lighting up her face. You taught me that. We've already started the infrastructure proposal. We just need the ghost to agree to the upgrade. Elias looked at the armor, then at the princess. The distance between two people felt smaller than it ever had. He saw the courage to speak a vulnerable truth in her eyes, and he realized that the difficult thing was no longer just surviving, it was evolving. All right, he said, his voice steady. Let's show the council what happens when human spite meets Valerius grace. But if this thing starts growing flowers on my visor, we're going to have a problem." Valera laughed, a sound of purely what she wanted that filled the room. "No flowers, Commander. Just a bridge. Now get ready. The aggressive bouncer is about to get a promotion." The Royal Engineering Spire was a place where gravity seemed optional, and the air was thick with the scent of solidified light and molten alloy. Elias stood in the center of a stabilization ring, his body finally healed but his mind racing. Princess Valera stood on the observation balcony, her vivid, expressive face tight with a mixture of anxiety and determination. Below them, the Valerius acolytes and human technicians, a rare sight working side by side, were preparing the bridge. The charcoal grey armor had been stripped to its skeletal frame, its jagged edges now being smoothed over by a translucent, pulsing membrane of Valerius neural mesh. It looked like a living lung had been grown over a suit of medieval plate. "This is the impossible part, Elias," General Vax shouted from the control console, his voice barely audible over the high-pitched whine of the integration beam. He still looked perpetually calculating, but there was a new glint of respect in his eyes. "We are attempting to slave your suit's aggressive OS to a biological processor. If the synchronization fails, the feedback loop will treat your brain like a blown fuse. You'll be the ghost in the machine literally and permanently." Elias gripped the handrails, his long fingers steady despite the chaos. "I've spent 10 years being a fuse for the human military, General. At least this time I'm choosing the socket." As the beam activated, a wave of cool and tingly energy washed over Elias, followed immediately by the crushing weight of a distributed energy system trying to find a home. He gasped, his knees buckling as the suit's sensors began to flood his mind. For years, the armor had felt like a heavy coat. Now, it felt like he was growing a second skin made of thunder and starlight. He could feel the water purification colonies in the lower levels of the spire, the humming floors of the palace, and even the insistent pulses of the distant swarm fleet. The Valerius tech wasn't just healing him, it was expanding him. He wasn't just a pilot anymore, he was a sensor array with a heartbeat. "Talk to me, Commander," Valera called out, her hands gripping the balcony railing so hard her lavender knuckles turned white. Elias didn't answer with words. Instead, he raised his arm, and the armor responded with a grace that was poetic and terrifying. The old screeching whine of hydraulics was gone, replaced by a low rhythmic thrum, the sound of a predator breathing. The suit didn't just move, it flowed. He felt the refreshing lack of pain as the neural mesh acted as a buffer, translating the brute force commands of his human brain into the elegant fluid motions of the Valerius. He looked at his hand. The charcoal grey ceramic now had a faint emerald glow beneath the surface, a constellation pattern that mirrored the skin of the princess. "Integration is at 74%, Vax reported, his voice tinged with a rare note of openly grinning excitement. "The human spite is successfully powering the Valerius Grace. We're seeing energy outputs that defy our detailed implementation schedules. He's generating enough kinetic potential to punch a hole through a moon." Elias felt the power surging through him, a feverish, artificial warmth that no longer felt like it was killing him. It felt like purpose. He looked up at Valera, and through the now transparent visor of his upgraded helmet, he gave her that rare smile. He didn't need the safely formal tone anymore. Suddenly the spire shook. A deep guttural roar echoed through the foundations of the planet, the sound of the nebula gates finally collapsing. The swarm had arrived. The defense grid is flickering. Minister Cora screamed from the communications hub, her stern face pale with terror. The sacrifice zones are being overwhelmed. The swarm is no longer just a tide. They've brought a harvester. Elias stepped out of the stabilization ring, his footsteps no longer making a dull thud, but a resonant, authoritative pulse. He looked at the holographic display. The blue lines of the civilian sectors were being swallowed by a sea of red. "The time for infrastructure proposals is over," Elias said, his voice now a perfect blend of human grit and Valerius resonance. He reached for his primary weapon, a heavy kinetic railgun that had been modified with a Valerius pulse amplifier. It looked like a relic from a brutish past that had been dipped in the future. "Princess, tell your people to get behind me. I'm going to show the swarm why you don't back a human into a corner, especially one who's finally had a good night's sleep." Valera nodded, her eyes angled with a fierce pride. "The palace is yours to command, Elias. Go, remind them that the Valerius Empire doesn't just build bridges, we defend them." Elias turned, the jagged edges of his shadow lengthening against the obsidian floor. He felt the ghost and the machine finally becoming one. As he ignited his jump thrusters, the floral ozone of the spire was replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of an impending storm. He wasn't just a temporarily assigned asset anymore. He was the reality of human warfare, evolved. The solidified light of the spire doors rippled and tore open as he punched through them at Mach 2. Behind him, the princess watched the streak of emerald and charcoal disappear into the darkened sky. She knew the scandal of their collaboration would be the talk of the galaxy for centuries, but as the first sounds of orbital bombardment began to rattle the windows, she only cared about one thing. She had seen the man behind the armor, and she knew that no matter how inelegant the fight became, he would never let her world fall. The distance between two people had been closed. Now it was time to close the distance between a predator and its prey. The sky above the Valerius capital was no longer a beautiful expanse of violet and starlight. It was a choked, chaotic canvas of orange fire and black smoke. The swarm's harvester, a biological behemoth the size of a mountain range, floated above the city, its underside pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic light as it prepared to strip the atmosphere. Thousands of smaller bladed interceptors rained down like a hailstorm of organic obsidian. Below, the Valerius planetary shields were flickering, their poetic geometry shattering under the brute force of the invasion. Then a single streak of emerald charcoal light tore through the clouds. Elias Thorne didn't descend, he plummeted. With the Valerius neural mesh feeding him a 360-degree tactical view, he saw the battlefield not as a soldier, but as a god of kinetic potential. He hit the ground in the middle of a swarm breach point with the force of a tactical nuke. The shockwave, amplified by his suit's new distributed energy system, turned the surrounding bladed monsters into dust. As the dust cleared, the humans in the nearby trenches, men and women in battered, inelegant armor, let out a roar that drowned out the sound of the orbital bombardment. They saw the ghost had returned, but he was different. He was glowing. Elias didn't wait for a detailed implementation schedule. He leveled his pulse-amplified railgun and pulled the trigger. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a rhythmic, musical thrum. A beam of white-hot kinetic energy tore through a kilometer of swarm ranks, vaporizing everything in its path. "Commander, the harvester is deploying its primary siphon." Valera's voice rang in his mind, clear and vivid despite the interference. She was watching from the command center, her fingers dancing over the holographic star chart. If it locks onto the palace spire, the planetary core will destabilize. Elias looked up at the gargantuan creature looming above. It was a Tier 4 nightmare, shielded by layers of regenerative chitin. "Princess, tell your generals to focus all fire on the escort ships. I'm going to handle the big one." He ignited his jump thrusters, but this time, he didn't just jump. The Valerius mesh on his armor collaborated with the air itself, creating a slipstream of solidified light that propelled him upward at speeds his old suit would have found impossible. The G-forces should have crushed his internal organs, but the water purification fluid that now filled his suit's internal lining acted as a perfect hydraulic buffer. He felt refreshing clarity as he wove through the swarm's defensive fire, his movements a poetic dance of human spite. He reached the harvester's primary eye, a wet, pulsing mass of sensory tissue. He could feel the creature's hunger, its mindless infrastructure proposal to consume his world. He didn't feel fear. He felt a feverish surge of protective rage. He jammed his gauntlet, now glowing with a blinding emerald light, directly into the creature's nerve center. Rejection protocol initiated. His suit's OS whispered in his ear, but the voice was no longer cold and metallic. It sounded like a handshake at the cellular level. He wasn't just dumping power, he was dumping his own vulnerable truth into the creature's hive mind. He showed the swarm the short-term thinking of a species that refused to be harvested. He showed them the 30 pounds of weight he carried for his friends. He showed them the distance between two people that can never be consumed. The harvester shuddered, its massive limbs flailing as the distributed energy of a human soul, amplified by Valerius tech, began to rewrite its biology from the inside out. The explosion was silent, a ripple of poetic destruction that turned the harvester into a cloud of glowing spores. As Elias fell back toward the planet, his suit's power levels hitting zero, he saw the swarm fleet begin to waver. Without their harvester, their logical calculation had shifted. The odds of success had dropped below the threshold of their hive intelligence. They were retreating. Elias hit the palace balcony with a heavy, brutish thud, his armor smoking and the emerald glow fading to a dull hum. He lay there, looking up at the sky as the violet stars began to peek through the smoke. He was degrading gracefully once again, his body screaming in protest. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a ghost. Valera was there in seconds, her formal robes scorched, and her skin mapped with a web of soot. She knelt beside him, her long fingers trembling, as she reached for his helmet release. "You did it, Elias. You panicked productively and saved a world." When the helmet hissed open, Elias looked up at her with bloodshot eyes that were full of a rare lopsided joy. "War is plumbing, remember? I just plugged the leak." He tried to sit up, but the weight of his gaze was too heavy. Valera caught him, pulling his head into her lap, ignoring the insistent pulses of her guards or the scandal of the moment. "The armor is ruined," Elias whispered, looking at the cracked charcoal plating and the torn neural mesh. "I'm back to being soft-skinned and fragile." Valera shook her head, her vivid face wet with tears that shimmered like solidified light. "No, Elias, you were never the armor. You were the bridge, and a bridge that survives a storm like this. That is a bridge that will stand forever." As the sun began to rise over the magnificent architecture of the Valerius capital, the people looked up and saw not a soldier and a queen, but two hearts finding their way toward each other across the impossible distances of a galaxy at war. In the weeks following the retreat of the swarm, the Valerius capital transformed. The solidified light of the reconstruction efforts hummed with a new frequency, one that carried the distinct rhythmic undertone of human engineering. Princess Valera stood on the high balcony of the restored command spire, watching the horizon. The sky was clear, the violet stars once again shining over a city that had learned to breathe through the smoke. Beside her, Elias Thorne stood without his charcoal-grey armor. He was dressed in a simple dark tunic of Valerius silk, his skin now clear and healthy, the invasive data ports at his temples replaced by small, elegant silver nodes that integrated seamlessly with the palace's healing network. "The council ratified the new accord this morning," Valera said, her voice carrying a refreshing lightness she hadn't possessed before the invasion. She turned to him, her skin shimmering with a soft constellation pattern of contentment. "The scandal of our integration has become the foundation of our future. General Vax is already complaining that the new hybrid defense grid is too efficient for his administrative staff to keep up with." Elias leaned against the railing, looking out at the magnificent architecture he had once viewed from behind a polarized visor. "Vax will find something else to grumble about. It's a brute force habit of high command, but he's right about one thing. The bridge is holding." The distance between two people, which once felt like light years of cultural incompetence and military dogma, had been replaced by a quiet, shared understanding. The infrastructure proposal for their lives was no longer about sacrifice zones or kinetic attrition. It was about the way the air felt when they walked through the gardens, or the way the humming floors seemed to acknowledge their presence as a pair. Elias looked at his hands, no longer trembling with the weight of 30 pounds of data or the strain of failing hydraulics. He was no longer a ghost in the machine. He was a man who had found a home in the most unlikely of places. "My people used to say that humans were short-term thinkers, because we were afraid of the dark," Valera murmured, stepping closer until her hand brushed his. "But I realize now that you don't fight because you're afraid. You fight because you're the only ones who truly value the light. You compress an eternity of love into the few decades you have, and you're willing to tear the universe apart to protect a single heartbeat." Elias smiled, that rare, lopsided expression that made the princess's heart perform its familiar gymnastics routine. "We're just excellent at panicking productively, Valera. And I think I've decided to spend the rest of my short-term thinking right here, with you." As the twin suns of the Valerius system began to set, casting long, poetic shadows over the obsidian towers, the two of them stood in silence. The reality of human warfare had been a terrifying revelation to the Empire, a glimpse into the brutish and inelegant lengths a species would go to for survival. But the reality of human peace was something far more profound. It was the courage to speak a vulnerable truth, the willingness to take off the armor, and the stubborn, impossible hope that two different worlds could find a way to beat as one. The galaxy was still vast, and the void was still cold, but on this small blue and violet world, the bridge was built, and it was strong enough to carry them both. The universe is often measured in light years and cold calculations, but as the stars began to twinkle above the spire, it was clear that the most important distances are the ones we close with a single step toward another. Sometimes the aggressive bouncer at the edge of the galaxy just needs a reason to put down the shield and stay for the celebration. And as Elias and Valera looked out at their shared world, they knew that the story of humanity wasn't just one of spite. It was a story of finding where you belong, even when you have to rewrite the laws of physics to get there. The echoes of the swarm have faded, but the story of the commander and his princess is just beginning. If this journey through the reality of human warfare and the bridges of the heart resonated with you, consider joining our ranks. You can show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with fellow travelers of the void. Don't forget to follow HFY Soundscape for more chronicles of human spirit and galactic wonder. What would you sacrifice to protect your world, and what armor are you ready to take off? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until our next transmission, keep your eyes on the stars and your heart on the bridge.